She weighed more than any woman Garrick Vane had ever laid eyes on, and the entire town of Black Hollow watched from their porches with smirks on their faces, waiting for him to send her away like he'd sent the others. 10 brides, 10 rejections. The mountain man hadn't kept a single one. Not the preacher's niece, not the banker's daughter, not the widow who could cook a feast from scraps. But this one, this round, soft-faced woman stepping off the supply wagon with a cracked trunk and mud on her boots. They were already laughing before she hit the ground. What they didn't know, what none of them could have predicted, was that Marlo Reed wasn't there to be chosen. She was there to survive. If the story already has you hooked, stay until the very end, because what happens in that snow pass is something you will not see coming. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Black Hollow, Montana Territory, late November. The supply wagon hit the rut so hard that Marlo Reed bit the inside of her cheek and tasted blood. She didn't make a sound. She pressed her tongue against the cut and stared at the grey wall of mountains ahead, her fingers gripping the sideboard of the wagon, while the driver, a reed-thin man named Cobb, who hadn't said 12 words to her in 4 days, clicked his teeth at the horses and kept his eyes on the trail. The Black Hollow Range was nothing like she'd imagined. She tried to imagine it on the train, and then on the stage, and then in the back of this rattling wagon. She told herself it would look like the illustrations in the newspapers, majestic, sweeping, somewhere a person could start over and be something different than what they'd been. Instead, it looked like the end of the world. The pines were so dense in places that the trail went dark even in the middle of the afternoon. The wind had a personality, not like back home in Cutter's Creek, where it just blew and went away. This wind came at you sideways and then circled back and found the gap between your collar and your neck and worked its way down your spine like a cold hand with a grudge. Marlo pulled her wool coat tighter across her chest. The coat was too small. It had always been too small. She'd bought it 3 years ago, thinking she would lose weight and fit into it properly by winter, and then she hadn't, and she'd worn it anyway because it was the coat she had. How much longer? She asked. Cobb shifted the reins to one hand and scratched behind his ear. Hour, maybe 2. She nodded and went back to watching the mountains. She had a letter folded in the inside pocket of her coat. She'd read it so many times in the past 6 weeks that the creases were soft as cloth, and the ink was wearing off the folded edges. It wasn't a warm letter. Garrick Vane had not written it himself. He dictated it to some clerk in the nearest town, she suspected, because the handwriting was neat in a bureaucratic way that didn't match the terse, clipped sentences. Miss Reed, I require a capable woman who can manage a remote homestead. The work is demanding and the winters are severe. I am not a sociable man. If you require comfort or conversation, seek arrangements elsewhere. I can offer shelter, provisions, and a legal arrangement. Nothing beyond that is promised. That was the whole letter. No pleasantries, no pretense. She'd shown it to her mother, who had pressed her lips together and said, Marlo, this man sounds like a horror. She'd shown it to her friend Agnes, who had read it twice and said, he sounds honest, at least. Marlo had thought about it for 3 days and then written back to say she was coming. What she hadn't told her mother or Agnes was the real reason. The real reason was that she was 24 years old and she'd spent the last 6 of those years being the joke that never got old in Cutter's Creek. The butcher's daughter who was too big, too plain, too much. She'd watched smaller women get chosen for things, jobs, dances, husbands, while she stood at the edges of rooms and smiled at the correct moments and pretended it didn't hollow something out in her. The letter from Garrick Vane was the first time anyone had written to her directly about capability. Not appearance, not temperament, not whether she'd make a pleasant wife at a dinner table. Capable woman, demanding work, severe winters. She could do all of those things. She didn't know yet if she could survive being sent away by the 11th man in a row, but she'd cross that when she got to it. The town of Black Hollow wasn't much. A trading post, a smithy, a feed store with a tilted sign, a saloon that was doing its best business at 3 in the afternoon, maybe 40 buildings total, scattered along a main road that turned to sucking mud every time it rained, which in this part of Montana was essentially always. Cobb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the trading post, and Marlowe climbed down before he could offer or not offer to help. She landed wrong on her left ankle and felt a sharp complaint from it that she ignored. She pulled her trunk down herself, dragging it over the sideboard and dropping it into the mud with a wet thud. People were watching. She'd expected that. Letters about the mountain man's arrangements passed through towns like water through a cracked cup. Everybody knew. Everybody talked. She counted at least 9 people who'd found reasons to be in the general vicinity of the trading post at this exact hour. A woman in an apron standing on the saloon steps. 2 men leaning on the fence of the corral. A cluster of older women near the dry goods entrance who weren't pretending to look at anything else. Marlowe straightened her coat, wiped the mud off her hands on the inside of her pocket where no one could see, and looked around for the man she'd come to meet. She almost missed him. I was standing at the far edge of the trading post porch, not in the middle, not somewhere visible, pressed against the post like he was hoping the building would swallow him. Tall, very tall, and broad across the shoulders in the way that came from actual work, not posturing. Dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that hadn't been shaved in at least a week. He wore a heavy canvas coat with a collar turned up against the wind, and he had his arms crossed over his chest and his eyes fixed on her with an expression that gave absolutely nothing away. She walked to him. The mud sucked at her boots with every step, and she was aware of the watching, and she did not look at the watchers. She stopped in front of him. "Garrick Vane," she said. It wasn't a question. "Reed," he said, just her last name, like she was a soldier or a supply order. "Marlowe," she said, "if you're going to use one word, use the right one." Something shifted in his face. It wasn't a smile. It was more like the almost twitch of a muscle that had forgotten what smiling felt like. "Marlowe," he said. Behind her, she heard someone on the saloon steps make a remark, too low to catch the words, and then the sound of suppressed laughter. She didn't turn around. "The letter said you'd tell me the situation when I arrived," she said. "I'm arrived." He looked at her for another moment, not in the raking, assessing way she was used to from men who were deciding whether she was worth their time. It was more direct than that, like he was trying to determine something specific. She didn't look away. "Situation is this," he finally said. "Homestead is 9 miles up the mountain. I work a trapline from November through March. There's a root cellar that needs winterizing, 2 horses, 4 dogs, a smokehouse that's partially collapsed, and whoever's been helping themselves to my catches has taken enough in the past month to make the difference between a solvent winter and a bad one." He paused. "That's the situation." Marlowe absorbed this. "And you need someone to manage the homestead while you work the lines. And someone who doesn't bolt the first week when the snow comes in." She heard it in his voice, not bitterness exactly, more like a man who'd said a version of the sentence enough times that it had worn smooth. "How many stayed past the first week?" she asked. His jaw worked slightly. "1. She made it 10 days. "The others?" First sight of the homestead, 2 of them didn't even get off the wagon. "What's wrong with the homestead?" "Nothing that isn't fixable. It's remote, it's rough, it's not what people expect." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know what you expect." "I expect rough," she said. "I expect remote. I didn't come up here for a parlor and a garden." This time the almost twitch in his face was more definite. Still not a smile, but something. "We should go before the light changes," he said. He picked up her trunk. She hadn't asked him to, and he didn't make an event of it, just lifted it and carried it to the wagon at the side of the building where a second horse was tied. She followed him, and they loaded the trunk in silence, and she climbed onto the wagon bench without ceremony, and he untied the horse and climbed up the other side, and that was that. As they pulled away from the trading post, she heard one of the women by the dry goods store say something that included the phrase "poor man" and the word "desperate," and she heard laughter. She watched the mountains and said nothing. The homestead was exactly what he'd said, and nothing that could have been properly imagined from words. It sat in a clearing that the pines gave up on reluctantly, like they'd tried to take it back and lost by a narrow margin. The main cabin was low and long, built from logs that had darkened to near black over the years. Sound though, she could see that even from a distance. The chinking was solid, the roofline was true, the chimney was straight. The smokehouse was another story. The east wall had partially caved in under what must have been a heavy snow load at some point, and it leaned at an angle that made her think of a man who'd been hit hard and hadn't quite fallen yet. There were 2 barns, one larger, one small, and a series of pens, and the root cellar entrance was visible as a set of heavy wooden doors set into a slope at the north side of the clearing. The dogs announced their arrival before the wagon had reached the clearing edge. 4 large animals with thick coats and voices that filled the mountains. They weren't unfriendly exactly, but they weren't friendly either. They circled the wagon with their heads low and their attention fixed on Marlowe with the intensity of creatures assessing something new in their territory. "They'll settle," Garrick said. "I know," she said. She'd grown up around working dogs. She knew the difference between aggression and evaluation. She held her hand low and let the nearest dog, a barrel-chested grey animal with a scarred nose, come to her. It took its time about it. Eventually it put its nose against her knuckles and inhaled slowly. Garrick said. "What?" Took Cobb 3 days to get that far. He set the brake and climbed down. "Come inside. I'll show you where things are." The inside of the cabin was not what she'd feared and not what she'd hoped. It was one large room with a sleeping loft above, a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall, and furniture that had been built for function with no argument whatsoever about form. A table, 4 chairs, a workbench, shelves loaded with equipment and supplies in an organization system that made sense to nobody who wasn't Garrick Vane. A wood stove in the kitchen corner that was well used and well maintained. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin, and something mineral she couldn't identify. There was a second smaller room off the back that he showed her briefly, a storage space with a narrow cot pushed against one wall. "That's yours," he said. "I sleep in the loft." She looked at the room, small, cold, dark. The single window was barely larger than her head and faced the trees. "All right," she said. Hum seemed to be waiting for something, an objection or a flinch, or some indication that she was calculating how long until the next supply wagon came back through. When she didn't give him one, he moved on. He showed her the food stores, more organized than the rest of the cabin, everything labeled and stacked with the careful attention of a man who understood what running out of something meant in a mountain winter. He showed her the horses, 2 dark bays, both large, one of whom pinned her ears and swished her tail when Marlowe put a hand on her neck. "That's Hester," Garrick said. "She doesn't like—" "She's in pain," Marlowe said. She ran her hand down the horse's left foreleg and felt the heat there, the slight puffing at the fetlock. "How long has she been off?" Garrick paused. 3 days. I thought she'd work it out." Marlowe crouched and looked at the leg more carefully. "She won't work this out on her own. She needs cold packs and rest, maybe a week. Do you have a bucket?" He showed her where. She started filling it with snow from outside the barn door, moving automatically, already thinking about the wrapping. "Do you have clean cloth? Strips, wide ones?" "I can find some." "She'll be fine," Marlowe said, "but she can't work, not on this." Garrick stood in the barn doorway with his arms crossed, watching her work, and didn't say anything. Dinner that night was a practical affair. Garrick cooked salt pork and beans and cornbread from a skillet, and they ate at the table across from each other in almost complete silence. The fire had warmed the cabin enough that Marlowe had shed her coat, and she was aware of herself in the way she always was in new spaces around new people. The space she took up, the chair that complained under her weight, the way she had to be careful about where she put her elbows. She'd learned not to make herself smaller. She'd tried that for years, and it had never worked. You can't actually make yourself smaller by wishing for it, and the effort of trying had taken up energy she'd needed for other things. But the awareness never fully went away. Garrick didn't look at her the way people looked at her in Cutter's Creek. He didn't look away with that studied indifference that was its own kind of comment. He mostly looked at the fire or his plate or a spot on the table, and when he did look at her it was direct, like he was listening to something she'd said even when she hadn't said anything yet. "The root cellar," she said eventually. "You mentioned winterizing. What's left to do?" He set his fork down and told her drainage was an issue. One of the shelf braces had rotted and needed replacing. The door seals needed recorking before the serious cold set in. She asked questions and he answered them, and by the time they'd finished eating, they'd had a complete conversation about root cellar construction that was the most words she'd heard him put together in a row. "You know about root cellars," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "My father grew vegetables," she said, "and my uncle ran a cold store for the county fair. I spent a lot of time in cold dark rooms." He looked at the fire. "Why did you come?" he asked. Not the practical answer, the real one. She thought about lying or deflecting. She was good at deflecting, had been doing it for years. Instead, she picked up her cup and said, "Because your letter was the first one that talked about what I could do instead of what I looked like." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like something breathing. Garrick nodded slowly, like that answer had confirmed something he'd suspected without being able to name. "Get some sleep," he said. "I need to check the east line at first light." She didn't sleep well. The room was colder than she'd expected, even with the extra blanket she'd found in the storage chest, and the wind was louder up here in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not frightening. She told herself it wasn't frightening, but unfamiliar. It pressed against the cabin walls and found the tiny places where cold could get through. And it was very dark in the way that places away from other people are dark, where there's no ambient glow from anywhere and your eyes can't adjust, because there's nothing to adjust to. She lay on her back and stared at where the ceiling would be if she could see it, and thought about what she'd gotten herself into. In the morning, she fixed a drainage issue in the root cellar that Garrick had apparently been working around for weeks. She found the problem, dug it out with a short-handled spade while lying on her side in the dirt, rerouted the channel with flat stones. She pulled from the slope nearby and then refilled and repacked the disturbed earth. It took 3 hours and left her filthy and with a long scrape across her forearm from a root she hadn't seen. When Garrick came back from the trap line at midday and went to the root cellar and stood in the entrance for a moment, she was at the workbench outside the barn, repairing the brace she'd pulled from the cellar shelving. He came and stood near her. "The drainage." "Fixed," she said. "The shelf brace needed full replacement. I'm making a new one." He watched her work for a moment. She was using a draw knife on a split piece of pine, taking it down to the right thickness. "You've done this before," he said. "I've done most things before," she said. It wasn't bravado. It came out flat and factual, the way it was true. He went inside without answering. When she came in an hour later, there was hot coffee on the stove and a second cup beside it. The first storm rolled in 4 days later. She'd watched it building for 2 days in the way the clouds stacked at the western peaks, and she'd used the time to finish the root cellar seals, get more wood under cover, and reorganize the food store so that the most critical supplies were in the most accessible positions. Garrick had watched her do it without commentary. When she explained the logic that in a real emergency, in bad conditions, you didn't want to be digging past winter squash to find the salt, he'd just said, "I'll remember that," and gone back to work. The storm arrived in the night. By morning the world was white in every direction, and the snow was still coming, and the pines were bending and snapping upright and bending again, and the temperature had dropped to somewhere that made the air feel like something that could hurt you. Marlowe was up before Garrick, which she suspected surprised him. She had the fire stoked and water heating, and was already dressed in the heaviest things she'd brought when he came down from the loft, and looked at the window and went very still for a moment. "How much?" she asked. 2 feet. Could be more before it stops." He looked at her. "The horses need to be checked. The door to the small barn drifts." "I'll go," she said. She'd already put her coat on. He looked at her with that look she was beginning to learn. The measuring look that wasn't condescending but was still a question. You can barely see the barn from... I followed the guide rope last night before the worst of it hit, she said. Tied it off at both ends, so we can find the barn and find our way back. He stood at the bottom of the ladder to the loft and looked at her across the cabin. I used to do it with my uncle, she said, when storms came in at the cold store. You tie the rope before you need it. Garrick Vane crossed the room, picked up his coat from the hook and said, I'll come with you. They checked the horses together. Hester's leg was already better. The cold treatments had done their work, and she'd been kept still enough that the swelling had retreated. The other horse, a gelding named Reeve, that Garrick seemed to trust above most other living things, was fine, unbothered by the storm in the way that horses who've seen enough of them eventually are. On the way back through the snow, following the rope with one gloved hand each, Marlowe slipped on an iced rock hidden under the drift and went down hard on her right knee. She heard Garrick's voice through the wind before she'd even registered fully that she'd fallen. You all right? And felt a hand on her arm steadying her. I'm fine, she said, and got up herself, because she was, and because she didn't need steadying, but she'd noticed that his hand had been there. It was day 11 when she found the first sign. She'd gone to check the closest section of the west trap line. Garrick had shown her the markers so she could check conditions while he worked the farther sections, and she found 3 traps sprung and empty that shouldn't have been, not animals. The ground around the traps was disturbed wrong, the way it looked when a person was trying to be careful, rather than the way it looked when an animal had been through. She crouched in the snow and studied the marks for a long time. The snow was old enough that the tracks were degraded, but she could see the shape of a boot heel at the edge of the disturbance. Large boot. Deep impression. She checked the other 2 traps in the section and found the same at each one. Disturbed, emptied, careful but not careful enough. She walked back to the homestead in the sharp early dark and found Garrick in the barn. Someone's taking from your waistline, she said. He looked up from the harness he was mending. What? 3 traps. All sprung, all empty, all disturbed in the same way. She described what she'd seen, the pattern of disturbance, the boot heel impression, the consistency. This wasn't animals. Someone got there before the animals could. Someone who knows where the line is. Garrick set the harness down slowly. His expression had gone very still, in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Not quiet but contained, like a fire when you've just stacked new wood on it and the heat is building without the flame yet. How long? He said. His voice was flat. The tracks were old, could be weeks. How short have your catches been running? He looked at the far wall of the barn. 6 weeks. I thought it was the weather patterns or the animal movements. He stopped. I marked it down to bad luck. It's not bad luck, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, show me tomorrow. Take me through what you saw. I'll take you through all 3, she said. He nodded once and picked up the harness again, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that his mind was already somewhere else, already following the problem along its roots to see where it went. She didn't push. She left him to it and went back to the cabin. But she thought about that boot heel all through the cold dark of the evening, while the fire burned and the storm that had passed left its silence over Black Hollow. And she thought about a man who worked these mountains long enough to know exactly where the trap lines ran. There was a particular afternoon, 2 weeks into her time on the mountain, that she thought of later as the turning point, though she couldn't have said exactly what turned. They'd been resetting the west line together, moving through the trees with the quiet efficiency of 2 people who'd figured out how to share space without stepping on each other. The cold had a texture by then that she was starting to read. She could tell the difference between the cold that was settling in for the day and the cold that meant something was shifting in the upper elevations. She'd said as much to Garrick, that she thought the temperature was dropping faster than it should be, and he'd looked at the sky above the tree line for a moment and said, we should turn back. They turned back. An hour later, the sky dropped another storm on them that would have caught them in the open among the high sets. Walking back through the trees, Garrick had looked at her and said, how did you know? I didn't know, she said. I guessed. It was a good guess. My father said you don't get good at reading weather until it's surprised you enough times that you start paying attention to the things that come before. Garrick was quiet for a few steps. Then, "Your father sounds like a practical man." "He was," she said. "He died 2 years ago. I'm sorry." "Thank you." She meant it, and it was said plainly without performance. She was finding that things said plainly were the only currency that worked with Garrick Vane. Anything with too much wrapping on it fell flat. Plain things landed. "My father was practical too," Garrick said. It seemed to cost him something. The words came out careful, like he was moving them around something he didn't want to disturb. "Not much else, but practical." "Is that where the homestead came from?" "He built the first cabin. I rebuilt it, fixed what he'd built badly." A pause. There was a lot to fix. She thought there was something under that, something about fathers and what they leave and what needs fixing. But she didn't pick at it. They walked in silence the rest of the way back, and it was comfortable in the way that silence isn't comfortable until two people have done enough together to earn it. The dogs had started following her. Not all four, the oldest one, a big black and white female named Soot, who Garrick said was 8 years old and had outlasted 3 trap partners, had decided within the first week that Marlowe was acceptable. By the end of the second week, Soot spent most of her indoor time in the vicinity of wherever Marlowe was working. The other 3 followed Soot's lead with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Garrick observed this without comment until one morning, when Marlowe came out of the storage room and nearly walked into him in the main room doorway, and he looked at Soot, who was sitting directly beside Marlowe's knee with the posture of a dog who has made a unilateral decision. And something in his face did that thing it did sometimes, that quality of feeling that moved through it and settled before it became anything readable. "Soot doesn't like people," he said. "She likes me," Marlowe said. "I can see that." "Dogs know," she said, and went to put the coffee on. She heard him behind her, the small sound of a breath that might have been something wry, and then his boots on the floor moving toward the door. Big. The town of Black Hollow sent its opinions up the mountain without being asked. The first time Marlowe went in with Garrick for supplies, 3 weeks in, she felt it before she could name it. The way conversations died in the trading post when they walked through the door. The way old Harmon behind the counter looked at Garrick with that specific pity mixed with contempt that men use on each other when one of them has done something the others think is beneath him. She kept her face neutral and helped load the supplies and said nothing. But outside, while Garrick was tying the loads down, a woman she didn't know approached her, 50s, substantial, wearing a good coat, and said in a low voice, "You know he'll change his mind. They always do eventually. You might as well make arrangements early." Marlowe looked at her calmly. "I appreciate your concern." "It's not concern," the woman said, and her voice was almost kind, which made it worse. "It's practicality. We've seen this before." "So have I," Marlowe said. "I've been the practical one in most of my situations. I'm good at it." The woman blinked, readjusted something in her expression, and left. Garrick appeared at her shoulder carrying a coil of rope. What did she want? "To warn me," Marlowe said. "Warn you about what?" She looked at him. He was watching her with his direct look, the one that she'd decided didn't actually want her to deflect. "About you mostly, about the pattern." He was quiet for a moment. And I told her I was good at practical situations." He looked at her for another second, and then he went back to the wagon, and she followed him, and they didn't talk about it on the drive back. But somewhere in the mountains above Black Hollow, the grey dog, Soot, ran alongside the wagon for a 1/4 mile before falling back, and the wind came from the west for once, and for a little while the cold let up enough that the afternoon almost felt survivable. It was nearly dark when they got back to the homestead, and Marlowe was unloading the last of the supplies when she noticed something that stopped her cold. The smokehouse door was open, not blown open. The latch was unhooked, hanging loose the way it hung when someone had opened it deliberately. She stood in the gathering dark and looked at it, and thought about the trap lines, and thought about that boot heel in the snow. She set the crate down and walked to the smokehouse, pushed the door wider. The partial collapse of the east wall meant the interior was exposed on one side to the sky, and the dying light came through enough that she could see clearly. 3 of the hanging cures were gone, clean cuts on the lines, not animal work, a knife taken at the tie points. so nothing was knocked about or disturbed. Careful work, efficient work, the work of someone who'd been inside before and knew exactly what they wanted. She stood in the ruined smokehouse in the cold dark and felt something solidify in her chest that she hadn't had a word for before. She'd been called a lot of things in her life. Slow, soft, easy to overlook, a woman that circumstances happened to rather than a woman who happened to circumstances. Whoever this was, whoever had been helping themselves to Garrick's trap lines and his stores and his hard winter's work, they had picked the wrong homestead to raid. Maybe they hadn't known she was here. Maybe they thought it was the same as before, the mountain man alone and overworked and not able to check every corner. She walked back to where Garrick was still unloading and said, "Someone's been in the smokehouse." He went very still. "3 cures gone," she said. "This wasn't tonight. The smell of the cuts is old. Last week maybe, while we had the second storm and couldn't check." He said a word, low and hard, that she hadn't heard him use before. "I know," she said, and then, "Garrick, this isn't random. Someone knows your property. They know your lines. They know your smokehouse. They know your patterns." His jaw was set, and there was something in his eyes that had moved past the usual contained expression into something older and rawer. "I know who it is," he said. She waited. "His name is Silas Mercer," he said, "and this has been going on a lot longer than 6 weeks." The last of the light left the mountains, and the cold came back full force, and somewhere down in the dark below them, the lights of Black Hollow flickered, small and distant, and Marlowe Reed stood in the snow outside a half-ruined smokehouse on a mountain that had killed gentler people, and looked at the man who'd kept the secret too long and thought, "Now we're getting to the real thing." She said, "Tell me everything." Garrick didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a moment, the way a man looks at a door he's kept locked for so long, he's almost forgotten what's on the other side. Then he turned away from the smokehouse and walked to the cabin, and she followed him. And neither of them spoke until they were inside with the door shut and the fire rebuilding from its afternoon embers. He poured himself water from the pitcher on the workbench. Didn't offer her any, not rudeness. She'd learned by now that he did things in sequence when he was thinking, and offering water wasn't in the sequence yet. She sat at the table and waited. He drank, set the cup down, turned to face her, and leaned against the workbench with his arms crossed. "Silas Mercer came to this valley 8 years ago," he said, "about 2 years after I finished rebuilding the homestead. He bought the Pell claim, the 300 acres on the South Ridge, and he had money, which was unusual, and he was sociable, which made him popular fast." He paused. "He and my father had a business arrangement before my father died. I don't know the full shape of it. What I know is that Silas believed part of my land was included in that arrangement. 100 acres on the east slope, where the best tree line is and where the spring runoff is predictable." "Is it," Marlowe asked, "included in the arrangement?" "No, I have the deed, my father's handwriting on the original claim documents. The 100 acres is mine, has always been mine." He looked at the fire. "But Silas doesn't accept that, and Silas has friends in Black Hollow who are willing to believe what he tells them, and Silas has the patience of a man who thinks time is on his side." "Because men like you work alone," Marlowe said. He looked at her sharply. "A man alone on a mountain," she said, "eventually makes a mistake, gets hurt, has a bad winter, loses enough on his trap lines to go into debt. And once you're in debt and alone, the land starts to look like it can be reasoned away from you." She folded her hands on the table. "Has he made you offers?" 3, over 5 years, each one less than the last. "Because he expected you to get weaker?" "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pressing against the north wall with that particular insistence that meant the temperature was still dropping. Soot was lying near the fire, tracking the conversation with her ears, even though her eyes were half closed. "The brides," Marlowe said. Garrick's expression shifted. "Not much, but enough. What about them?" "That's part of it, isn't it? If you had a partner, someone helping you manage the homestead, you'd be harder to wear down. Silas would have known that, and 10 women leaving one after another, that's a story that travels. It makes you look like a man no one wants to be around. Makes the whole situation look hopeless." She looked at him steadily. "Did he have anything to do with any of them leaving?" The silence was long enough to have weight. "I don't know for certain," Garrick said. "The second woman, she left in the night, wouldn't say why. I always thought it was just the isolation. But she'd been into town the day before." He stopped. "Silas runs the trading post supply agreement. He's in that store 3 days a week." Marlowe thought about the woman who'd approached her outside the trading post. The kind voice making practical suggestions about making arrangements early. She thought about how many people in that town were connected to Silas Mercer without necessarily knowing the full shape of what they were connected to. "How much has he taken from your lines this season?" she asked. "If it's been consistent since October," Garrick did the calculation without needing to write it down. "Close to a third of my expected yield, maybe more." "That's not petty theft, that's a strategy." "Yes," he said, "it is." They looked at each other across the cabin room in the firelight and the cold, and something settled between them. Not warmth, not yet, but the specific quality of two people who have arrived at the same understanding from different directions and recognized each other in it. "We need proof," Marlowe said, "not suspicion. Proof you can put in front of someone whose word means something. The county marshal is in Stillwater. That's 4 days' ride in good weather. Then we need proof we can keep until good weather." She looked at her hands on the table. "And we need to know exactly where he's taking what he steals. He's not eating it himself, and he's not storing it at home if he has any sense. He's selling it. There's a buyer somewhere." Garrick uncrossed his arms and stood straight. It was the posture she'd started associating with him, shifting from thinking to deciding. "The Rundle Valley traders come through in February. Cash buyers, no questions asked on provenance." He said it with the flat disgust of a man who knew exactly how that system worked and had never had cause to use it himself. "That would be where? February is 3 months." "Yes." "So we have 3 months to build something that holds," she said. He nodded once. "All right," she said, and got up to help with the fire. That night was the first night she heard him have the nightmare. She didn't know what it was at first, came up through layers of her own thin sleep, thinking it was the wind or one of the dogs. And then she was fully awake and sitting up in the dark of her small room, and the sound was coming from the loft above. Not loud. That was almost the worst of it. It was quiet, a kind of strained, pressured breathing, and once a word that might have been a name or might not have been a word at all. She sat in the dark and listened and did not move. She understood the privacy of other people's bad nights. She'd had enough of her own. After a while it stopped. She heard him shift, and then the slow regularity of sleep returning. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling and thought about fathers who left things that needed fixing, and debts that traveled forward in time looking for someone to collect from, and men who worked alone long enough that alone started to feel like the only option. She was still awake when the first grey light came around the edge of the window. She got up and started the fire. The days that followed had a pattern to them that was partly practical and partly something else she didn't examine too closely. Garrick on the trap lines, Marlowe managing the homestead and beginning to record, carefully in a small notebook she'd found in her trunk, the dates and locations of the disturbances she found on the west line when she checked it. She started marking the signs in ways that wouldn't be obvious to whoever was working the line. A particular arrangement of small stones near the disturbed traps, branches broken at specific heights, signs that would tell her if someone came back. They came back. 6 days after the smokehouse discovery, she found 2 traps on the west line emptied again, and her stone markers disturbed. She stood in the trees and looked at the fresh boot prints, clearer this time, the cold having crusted the top layer of snow in a way that held the impression better, and she traced them back as far as she could go before they disappeared into a section of rock where the wind had scoured the surface clean. South. The prints went south before they vanished. South was Silas Mercer's ridge. She documented it in her notebook when she got back. Date, location, depth and size of the prints, direction of travel, what was taken, approximate time frame based on the condition of the snow around the traps. She was building something line by line in the same steady way she'd sealed the root cellar and fixed the shelf brace and packed the cold on Hester's leg. Not exciting work, not the kind of thing anyone would look at and call brave, just the work of paying attention and writing it down and not stopping. Garrick read each entry in her notebook when she showed him, and he didn't say much, but she noticed that he started carrying the notebook in his coat when they went out together on the lines, as if it had become a tool like the others. It was around this time that the trouble with Cobb started. Cobb, the wagon driver who'd brought her up from the valley, was apparently a fixture of Black Hollow social life in the way that men who carry information tend to be. He drove supply runs between the valley settlements and the trading post, and he talked, and what he talked about these days was Marlowe, Reed, and Garrick Vane, in the way that people talk about things they find funny or sad or worth dissecting. She heard about it from Garrick, who heard about it from the farrier in town on a supply run. Specifically, Cobb had been telling people that Garrick had kept the fat woman because he'd run out of options and she was too foolish to leave, that Marlowe was managing the homestead the way a stray manages a porch, not because she was capable, but because she had nowhere else to go. Garrick told her this at the table over supper, watching her face while he said it. "What do you want me to do with that information?" she asked. "Nothing. I just thought you should know what was being said." "I know what's being said," she said. "People have been saying versions of it my whole life. It doesn't change the notebook or the root cellar or Hester's leg." She cut a piece of salt pork in half. "Does it bother you, what they say?" I thought about that, really thought, not the pause before a polite answer. "It bothers me that it's being said about you," he said. "Not because of what it does to my reputation, because it's wrong, and wrongness about a person He stopped. She waited. "A person I respect," he finished, and looked at his plate. The fire did its small sounds. Soot thumped her tail once on the floor from her place near the hearth. Marlowe said, "Thank you," and meant it, and didn't make anything more of it, because he'd find that excruciating, and she didn't have any interest in making him excruciating. But she carried it with her afterward, the weight and the warmth of it, in the careful way you carry something you don't want to drop. December came in like something with a grudge. The temperature dropped to places that made the earlier cold feel like a memory of warmth, and the storms came in faster and closer together, so that there were weeks where the world beyond the clearing was simply white and impenetrable, and the homestead was the whole of existence. The trap lines became a daily negotiation with conditions, Garrick learning to read Marlowe's weather instincts alongside his own, Marlowe learning the particular language of the mountain in winter that he'd been speaking alone for years. There was an afternoon in the second week of December that she thought about later, without being able to say exactly why it lodged in her memory so specifically. They'd come back from the East Line in a wind that had been genuinely unpleasant, the kind that found every weakness in your gear and exploited it. And they'd come inside and there was ice in her hair, and her hands were so cold she couldn't feel her fingers properly, and she'd gone to the fire and crouched in front of it, holding her hands out, and Garrick had come up behind her and, without asking, without making it a thing, wrapped her hands in his for a moment, just covering them until she could feel the warmth from his palms coming through, and then he'd let go and moved away to hang his coat, and neither of them said anything about it then or later. It was nothing. It was also something, and they both knew it, and the knowing was enough for now on a mountain where the winter had a long time still to run. The bigger complication came with the arrival of Jonas Pratt. Pratt was Silas Mercer's man in the way that some people are other people's men, hired on as ranch hand nominally, actually functioning as something between a messenger and an enforcer. He was younger than Marlowe expected, mid-20s, lean in the way of someone who moves a lot, with a face that wore friendliness like a coat he'd put on that morning and might take off in the afternoon. He showed up at the homestead on a Tuesday in mid-December, which was brazen enough on its own, riding up through the tree line on a horse that wasn't dressed for the cold it was in. He knocked on the cabin door like a man paying a social call. Garrick answered it. Marlowe was at the workbench behind him and stayed there. "Garrick," Pratt said, with the smile on full. "Been a while. Silas wanted me to ride up, say hello, see how the winter's treating you." "Silas could ride up himself," Garrick said. "You know how he is. Busy man." Pratt's eyes moved past Garrick to Marlowe. He held the smile, but something calculated came into it. This must be the new wife. Not your business, Garrick said. Just being friendly. Pratt leaned against the doorframe in a way that was meant to look casual and communicated the opposite. Silas is still interested in the East Slope, Garrick. He wanted me to mention that the offer's still open. Better terms than before, even given. And here he paused with the timing of someone who'd practiced it. Given that winters up here aren't getting any easier, Marlowe set down the tool she was holding and turned to face the door. What terms? She asked. Pratt looked at her. So did Garrick, a quick look, checking something. Beg pardon, Pratt said. The offer. What are the terms? She walked toward the door, stopped beside Garrick. If Silas is serious about buying the East Slope, he'd put numbers to it. What did he tell you to say? Pratt's smile adjusted itself. It's more of an opening conversation. No, she said. It's a visit time to coincide with the worst of winter, worded to sound like concern, but structured to feel like pressure, which means Silas is worried about something. She tilted her head slightly. What's he worried about? The smile stayed on Pratt's face, but it had gone to a different place entirely. The place where smiles go when they're doing a job and not actually connected to anything underneath. I'll tell him you're well, Pratt said to Garrick, ignoring her now, in the deliberate way that was its own kind of response. Tell him to come himself if he has something to say, Garrick said. I'm not conducting business through messengers. Pratt left. They watched him ride back into the trees, and the cold came through the open doorway until Garrick shut it. He'll tell Silas what I said, Marlowe said. Yes. Is that a problem? Garrick turned away from the door. I don't know yet. Silas doesn't like being read clearly. He prefers to think he's subtler than he is. He looked at her. You read him clearly. I've been in rooms with men like that my whole life, she said. Men who think a woman present in the room isn't really present in the conversation. She picked up her tool again and went back to the workbench. It's useful, actually. They don't guard what they say carefully enough. Garrick watched her for a moment. He'll be more careful now that he knows you're watching. Good, she said. Careful people make different mistakes than careless ones. Different mistakes leave different evidence. Garrick was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I want to show you something tomorrow on the East Slope. All right. There's a section you haven't seen yet where the spring drainage comes off the high ridge. He paused, and she could hear something deliberate in the pause, something chosen. It's the most valuable part of the land. I want you to understand why I won't sell it. She kept her eyes on her work and said, I'll come with you, and did not say the other thing, which was that she thought she already understood. Had already understood since the night she'd heard him have the nightmare in the loft, had already understood in the way you understand something about a person that they haven't said out loud and might not know how to. The East Slope the next morning was white and blue, and the kind of beautiful that the rest of the mountain sometimes almost managed, and didn't quite. The spring wasn't running, frozen deep under a month of cold, but Garrick showed her where it came up through the rocks, and where the drainage ran, and where the soil on the south-facing exposure was a different color than the surrounding land, richer and darker. I'll explain the floodplain implications for summer grazing and the access to the high pasture and the way the tree line on that slope sheltered the lower clearing from the north wind in a way that the rest of the homestead ground didn't have. He talked about it the way he talked about very few things. Without the rationing, without the careful measurement of words, she listened without interrupting. When he was done, he looked at the frozen spring for a moment and said, My father found this place and understood none of it. He filed the claim and started building before he thought through a single season. He didn't know about the drainage or the soil. He just wanted land that looked big from the outside. He crouched and picked up a stone from beside the frozen spring, turned it over in his gloved hand. I stayed. I learned it. 12 years of learning this specific piece of mountain. He set the stone down. That's what Silas wants to buy, not acreage. What 12 years of a person's attention has done to a place. She stood beside him in the cold and the blue-white light and said, He can't have it. No, Garrick said, he can't. They stood there for another minute, not saying anything else, and the mountain was quiet around them in the particular way it was quiet after a storm had cleared, like something listening, like the whole weight of it paying attention. and Marlowe thought about what it meant to fight for something, not because someone told you to or because you were supposed to, but because you'd looked at it long enough and in enough detail to know it was worth the cost. She'd been looking at the homestead that way for weeks now. She'd been looking at the man beside her that way too, though she was not ready to put words to that yet. They went back down the mountain in the early afternoon, and the cold was serious and the trail was hard work, and when they got back to the clearing, Reeve had knocked a water trough and needed resetting, and Hester had gotten into the feed storage somehow and made a mess of it, and the practical world came back like it always did after moments of clarity, demanding its share of attention. She fixed the trough, she cleaned up after Hester, she started supper, and in her small room that night, by the light of the single candle she kept on the box beside her cot, she opened the notebook and wrote down the date and the size of the prints and the direction and everything she'd noticed about Jonas Pratt's eyes when he'd looked past Garrick at her, and the way the smile had changed, and what that change might mean about what Silas Mercer was afraid of, and what he might decide to do about it. The notebook was getting heavy. The evidence was building. And somewhere on the South Ridge, in a house that Marlowe had never seen but was beginning to understand, a man named Silas Mercer was getting an unfavorable report from his messenger and deciding what came next. The winter was only halfway through. Jonas Pratt came back 11 days later. This time he didn't knock. Marlowe was alone in the barn when she heard Soot bark, not the investigative bark the dog used for deer at the tree line, but the short, sharp one she used for people she'd already decided about. By the time Marlowe reached the barn door, Pratt was already in the clearing, and he hadn't come alone. There was another man with him, broader, older, with a grey beard and the particular stillness of someone who'd been in enough bad situations to have stopped being nervous about them. Garrick was on the east line. He'd been gone since before first light and wouldn't be back until the early afternoon at the earliest. Marlowe stepped out of the barn and let the door close behind her. Soot positioned herself at her left knee. The other 3 dogs came from the far side of the clearing, reading the moment correctly. "Mr. Pratt," she said. "Ma'am." He was still doing the smile, but something in it had changed since the last visit, thinned out like fabric that's been washed too many times. "Garrick around?" "No." "When's he back?" "I don't share that information with people who show up to my home unannounced." She looked at the other man. "I don't know you." "That's Dell," Pratt said. "He works for Mr. Mercer, same as me." Dell said nothing. He was watching the dogs with a professional awareness that told her he'd had previous experience with dogs that didn't like him. "You can leave a message," Marlowe said, "and I'll see Garrick gets it." Pratt tilted his head slightly. "Or we could wait." "You could," she said, "but you'd be waiting outside and it's 12 degrees, so that's your decision to make." Pratt looked at her for a moment with the thin smile fully retired now. She could see him recalculating something. She'd seen the same recalculation on Jonas Pratt's face before, on the faces of men who'd come expecting a particular kind of woman and found a different kind, the kind that didn't shuffle and apologize and make it easy. "Mr. Mercer has a new proposal," Pratt said. "He wanted Garrick to have it before the end of the month. Write it down and leave it. I'll see he gets it today." "It's better delivered in person." "Then Mr. Mercer should deliver it in person." She held his gaze. "Is there anything else?" A silence that was slightly too long to be comfortable. Dell shifted his weight on his horse. Soot hadn't moved from Marlowe's knee. "Mr. Mercer thinks," Pratt said slowly, "that you might be having some influence on Garrick's decision-making regarding the east slope." "Mr. Mercer thinks right," she said, "because I live here now, and it's my home too, and I have opinions about it. That's what happens when a person marries into a situation. They become part of it." She let that settle for a moment. If that's what's worrying Silas, he should have moved faster than 6 years ago. Pratt stared at her. Dell was still watching the dogs. "You don't know the full history between Silas and Garrick," Pratt said. His voice had dropped the social register it had been wearing and become something flatter. "There are agreements going back to Garrick's father that complicate the land question in ways that—" "I know exactly what agreements you're referring to," she said, which was a partial bluff. She knew the shape of what Garrick had told her, though not every detail. and I know they don't hold up against a deed recorded at the county level, which means they're an argument for a lawyer or a marshal, not for unannounced visits to a woman alone. She looked at both of them. You should go. Tell Silas to come himself if he has something real to say. They went. She watched until the horses disappeared back into the trees, and then she let out a breath that was partly relief and partly something more like anger that had been compressed into steadiness for the length of the conversation. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from cold. She went back into the barn and stood with Hester for a while, her forehead against the horse's warm neck, and let the shaking pass. When Garrick came back at midday, she told him everything, every word, the exact sequence, the change in Pratt's face when she wouldn't yield, Dell, and the way he'd watched the dogs. Garrick listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood at the workbench with his hands flat on the surface and his head slightly down, and she could see him processing it the way he processed things that angered him. Quietly, with the contained quality, the new wood on the banked fire. He sent 2 of them, Garrick said. Yes. He's escalating. Yes. She paused. He's also making mistakes. He told me he's worried about my influence. He wouldn't have said that if he was thinking clearly. She pulled the notebook from her coat and set it on the workbench. I've been thinking about the February traders. If Silas has been storing and selling your catches through them, there'll be a record somewhere. Cash buyers keep their own tallies even when they don't ask questions. It's how they manage inventory and pricing. Garrick looked at the notebook. How would we get at those records? We probably can't get at the records themselves, but if we know the buyer and we can get someone credible to approach them before Silas does this February, we might get a statement. Traders care about their own legal exposure if they understand that Silas is making them party to stolen goods. She stopped. Do you know who the specific buyer is in Rundle Valley? Garrick thought for a moment. There's a man named Cutler, runs a consolidated trading operation out of the Rundle Valley settlement, buys furs, cured meat, anything with value in bulk. He looked at her. He and I have done legitimate business 2 seasons back. Good, she said. That means he knows your name and he knows your product. If stolen goods from your land have been moving through his operation, he may not know their origin, or he may suspect and has chosen not to ask. She tapped the notebook. Either way, the conversation is one worth having, but not by you. You're too close to it. He'll see a man trying to recover a grievance. Then who? She looked at him steadily. Let me think on that, she said, because she had an idea, but it wasn't fully formed yet, and she'd learned not to put half-formed ideas in front of Garrick until they had enough shape to hold. That night, while the wind worked at the cabin walls and Garrick sat near the fire, mending a section of trapline with the focused patience he brought to anything with his hands, Marlowe sat at the table with the notebook open and wrote. Not evidence this time, a letter, several drafts of a letter actually. She'd write a version, read it, cross it through, start again. She was trying to find the exact tone that would accomplish something specific, and she wasn't finding it on the 1st or 2nd or 4th attempt. Garrick looked up once and said, What are you writing? A letter to a man named Cutler, she said. He put his work down. She could feel his attention sharpening without looking up. You said not by me. It's not from you. She kept writing. It's from me, a woman who recently came to a homestead and has discovered discrepancies in her household's expected winter income, who is concerned about legal exposure to goods of uncertain origin that may have passed through a reputable trading operation. She paused over the page. Traders don't respond to accusations, they respond to the word exposure. Garrick was quiet for a moment. That's well thought. I've been thinking about it for 3 days, she said. I didn't want to say anything until I knew it would work. She wrote 2 more drafts before she had something she was willing to read aloud to him. He listened with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the fire. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, Change one thing. The 2nd paragraph, don't say discrepancies. Say irregularities. It sounds more like a woman with a lawyer behind her. She looked at the paragraph. He was right. Do I have a lawyer behind me? No, but Silas doesn't know that. She changed it. The letter went out with the next supply wagon run, tucked inside an envelope addressed in her careful handwriting, sealed with wax because she had some in the bottom of her trunk, and it seemed like the kind of detail that mattered for the impression she was trying to make. She gave it to Cobb without explanation and watched him tuck it into the mailbag with the indifferent efficiency of a man who carried 100 letters and didn't think about any of them. She thought about this one for the next 2 weeks without allowing herself to think about it constantly, which was a discipline she'd developed over years of waiting for things she'd set in motion and couldn't control. Christmas came and went on the mountain with very little ceremony. Marlowe made a better version of the salt pork supper. She'd figured out the spice situation in Garrick's stores well enough by then to improve on the plain preparation he defaulted to. And Garrick, with the air of a man who had considered not saying anything and decided otherwise, produced a small folded paper from his coat pocket and set it on the table beside her plate. She opened it. It was a drawing, rough pencil lines. Clearly not an artist at work, but someone who could render a thing with reasonable accuracy. It was the east slope, the spring, the rocks, the specific way the tree line bent in the wind on the upper ridge. Small and detailed and particular. I drew it, he said, as if this might not be obvious. I can see that. I didn't have... He stopped, searched, found the end of the sentence somewhere. I thought you should have something of the place, in case you wanted to remember it later. She looked at the drawing for a moment and thought about all the things contained in the phrase, in case you wanted to remember it later. The uncertainty in it, the specific fear it was walking around, the fact that he'd drawn it rather than said any of it. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He looked at the fire. Garrick. She waited until he looked at her. I'm not going anywhere, she said again, and she meant it with all the weight she could put behind 2 words. Meant it for all the ways he was still waiting for the next woman to decide the mountain wasn't worth staying for. He nodded. It was a small motion, but it was the kind of small that lands with full force. She folded the drawing and put it in her coat pocket, and they finished their supper, and it was a decent Christmas for a mountain in the middle of winter. January was brutal in ways that went beyond weather. The first thing that happened was a dead trap. Not raided this time, but destroyed. Someone had taken an axe to it, or something with the weight and force of an axe. She found it on the north segment of the west line, splintered into pieces that had been scattered across a radius of several feet, clearly done with enough force to be more than careless. She stood looking at the pieces in the snow and felt the shift in the situation. The same feeling you get when weather changes and the pressure drops fast and the light goes wrong. This was no longer about theft. This was about a different kind of message. She brought the pieces back to the homestead in her pack and laid them on the workbench without drama. Garrick looked at them for a long time. He's getting impatient, Marlowe said. Or scared, Garrick said. Scared does this more than impatient. He picked up a piece of the splintered wood. This took real effort. Somebody worked at this. Was it a valuable set? Second most productive on the west line. His jaw was tight. Whoever did it knew that. Pratt knew, she said, from the first visit. He was looking at your operation while he was talking. Garrick set the piece down. I need to go into town. She looked at him. His face had the set expression of a man who was going to do something he'd been not doing for a long time. What are you going to do? Talk to Harmon at the trading post. He knows Silas's business better than he lets on. He's been uncomfortable with it for a while. I can see it in him every time Silas's name comes up. He paused. I've let that alone because I didn't want to push a man who wasn't ready. But a destroyed trap is a different thing than stolen furs. That's property damage. That's law. Harmon might go straight to Silas. He might. Garrick met her eyes. But you said scared people make different mistakes than careless ones. I think Harmon's been scared for a while. I want to find out what of. She went with him. She hadn't planned to suggest it, but when he was bridling Reeve, she came out of the cabin with her coat on, and he looked at her and didn't say anything, just moved to prepare the second horse without comment, and they rode down the mountain together in the sharp January air, with the dogs following to the tree line and then peeling off to go back to the warmth they had more sense than to leave. Black Hollow in January was deeply uninterested in being outside. The main road was empty except for a figure hunched against the wind near the smithy, and the trading post had the muffled quality of a place that had pulled its warmth around itself and was waiting for spring. Inside, it smelled like tobacco and leather and the slightly sour warmth of a wood stove that had been running too hot. Harmon was behind the counter. He was a big man in his late 50s who had the face of someone who'd started out optimistic and been revised considerably by experience. He looked up when they came in, and something in his expression tightened, not unfriendly but wary, the wariness of a man who can read a room and sees Garrick Vane's face and knows there's a conversation coming that he hasn't been looking forward to. Garrick. He looked at Marlowe. "Ma'am." "Harmon," Garrick said. He didn't move to the counter immediately. He let the moment breathe the way he did. "I need to talk to you about Silas Mercer." The man behind the counter looked down at his hands for a moment. Then he said, "You want to close the door?" Garrick closed it. What came out in the next 20 minutes, haltingly and with several stops and restarts from a man who had clearly been carrying it too long, was worse than Marlowe had calculated. Harmon had been allowing Silas to use the trading post's back storeroom for goods that weren't inventoried in the main ledger. He hadn't asked where the goods came from. That was what he told himself, and Marlowe believed he'd almost made himself believe it, but she could see in his face that some part of him had known and had looked away, because Silas Mercer had his own kind of leverage, the kind that arrived quietly and made a man feel that the most comfortable thing was to not ask the specific question. The leverage in Harmon's case was a debt, a loan from Silas 3 years ago when Harmon's supply line had dried up for a season, and he'd needed operating capital. The loan had been called in unexpectedly last spring at terms Harmon hadn't anticipated from the original agreement. "He can do that?" Marlowe asked. "Call it in early." "He wrote the agreement," Harmon said heavily. "I should have had someone else read it before I signed. He stopped. "I was in a bad position. I signed." She thought about the brides, the careful undermining over years, the debt as a tool. Silas Mercer was not a man who made sudden moves. He was a man who arranged things far in advance and waited for them to become useful. "The goods in the back," Garrick said. His voice was controlled in a way that sounded like significant effort. "Are any of them from my lines?" Harmon looked pained. "I don't know the origin. I genuinely don't. But the volume that's been moved through," he shook his head. "Garrick, it was substantial. More than I should have allowed. I knew that even when I was letting myself not know the rest of it." Garrick put both hands on the counter. Not aggressive, but it was a statement. "I need you to write down what you've told me, every detail, the loan, the storeroom arrangement, the dates and the volumes, everything." Harmon looked at his hands again. "If I do that and Silas finds out before." "He'll find out eventually," Marlowe said. "The question is whether he finds out when you've already done the right thing or before. One of those positions is better than the other for you legally." She paused. "And I think you know that already. I think that's part of why you're telling us." Harmon was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked. Somewhere outside on the empty road the wind made itself known. "I'll write it down," he said. "Give me until tomorrow." They left with nothing in hand but a promise from a frightened man, which was not the same as evidence, but was the beginning of something. Riding back up the mountain in the afternoon cold, Marlowe ran the pieces through her head. The notebook of trap-line disturbances, the letter to Cutler, Harmon's testimony if he held his nerve, the destroyed trap, which was documentation of property damage if she photographed the pieces or had them witnessed. Each piece alone was not enough. Together they were beginning to be something. "He'll hold," Garrick said, out of nowhere, as if he'd been following the same track she was on. "I think so too," she said. "He's been looking for a reason." "Yes." She looked at the trail ahead, the white and grey and the pines closing back in on either side. "Silas has been collecting obligations from people in this town for years. That kind of system works until it doesn't. Until one person decides the weight of it is worse than the fear of it. And then it moves fast," Garrick said. "Yes." She pulled her collar up against a gust of wind. "It tends to move very fast." She was right about that, but she hadn't predicted the direction it would move in first. 12 days later, on a Thursday evening when the temperature had dropped to somewhere that felt personal, Garrick was ambushed on the south section of the East Line. She didn't know it had happened until he didn't come back. I was supposed to be back by late afternoon. She waited until the light was going, telling herself there were legitimate reasons. A difficult section of line, a problem with the equipment, weather moving slower than expected. But Soot had been at the door for an hour, not barking, just standing at the door with her ears forward and her body language carrying a message that Marlowe did not want to receive. At dark, she lit the storm lantern and went out. She found him a half-mile down the south trail, on his feet but barely, one hand against a pine tree and the other pressed to his side. He'd been on the ground. She could see where he'd gone down and pushed himself back up, the disturbed snow, the handprints. His face in the lantern light was the color of old ash. Garrick. She was beside him before she'd finished saying his name, her hand on his arm, reading the situation as fast as she could. What happened? Talk to me. 2 of them, he said. His voice was controlled but thin. I didn't see them until... He stopped, inhaled with a care that told her breathing was costing him. Hit me from behind first, then when I was down. Can you walk? I walked this far. Can you walk further? Yes. He said it with conviction that was partly a decision rather than entirely a fact. She got her shoulder under his arm and they walked. It was slow and she didn't ask him to go faster and he didn't try to tell her he was fine. The lantern swung between them and the cold was serious and it took them 40 minutes to cover ground she'd normally cross in 12. Getting him inside, getting him onto the bench by the fire, getting his coat off to look at the damage. All of it done in the specific calm she could hold when she needed to hold it, the calm that wasn't absence of feeling but management of it. His side had taken a boot more than once. She could see the bruising already coming up in the dark colors that meant deep tissue. His shoulder was wrong, not dislocated, she thought, but badly wrenched, the muscle pulled. There was a cut at his temple that had bled considerably and looked worse than it probably was, which was fortunate. Nothing broken. She was almost sure nothing was broken, but she wasn't a doctor, and almost sure was not the same as sure, and she kept that qualification where she could see it. She cleaned the cut. She wrapped his ribs. Not because binding helped broken ribs, which she knew, but because the wrap gave some stability to bruised ones and he needed to be able to breathe without the specific kind of pain that makes breathing a decision. She heated water and found the cloth and did all of it without asking for permission for any of it, because he was in the condition that required someone to just handle things, and she was someone who could handle things. Hun let her, which she thought was its own kind of trust from a man who didn't give trust easily. When she was done, and he was propped against the wall with the heat reaching him and a cup of something hot in his less damaged hand, he said, "They left a message." She looked at him. He reached into his coat, slowly, carefully, his face tightening as he did it, and produced a folded piece of paper. She opened it. Last offer. Sign the east slope over in the next 30 days. Leave the matter of winter losses unclaimed. Do this and there are no further problems. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. She looked at the paper for a long moment and then folded it back along its creases and put it in her coat pocket, next to the notebook and next to the folded drawing of the east slope that she'd been carrying since Christmas. Garrick was watching her. His face was exhausted and hurt, and underneath that there was something else. Not defeat, nothing like defeat, but something honest. Something that had dropped the last of whatever he'd been keeping up for propriety's sake. Something that looked a lot like a man who had run out of the energy required to pretend that this didn't matter, that he didn't need anyone, that he'd been fine alone. We need to move, she said. Not away, forward. We need to move before he thinks this worked. I can't ride for at least... I know, she said. I can. He looked at her. I can ride, she said. And I know the trail to Stillwater because you told me about it last month when we were talking about the Marshall, and I've been looking at the terrain and thinking about the route since then, because I had a feeling we might need it. She met his eyes. I can take the notebook, Harmon's statement if he's written it, the message, everything we have. 4 days to Stillwater in reasonable conditions. The pass above the North Ridge, he said immediately, in January. "I know the pass is bad," she said. "What's the alternative?" He looked at the fire. He looked like a man doing a calculation he didn't want to reach the answer to. "There's a lower route," he said slowly. "It adds a day, maybe a day and a half, but it stays below the exposed section of the North Ridge, and there are 2 trap shelters along the way that would be usable overnight. I haven't used that trail in 3 years because it's longer, but in conditions like this—" "Show me," she said. "Draw it for me right now, while it's clear in your head." I did. Slowly, carefully, on the back of the blank page she tore from the notebook, he drew the route. Every landmark he could name, every decision point, the location of the 2 shelters, the stream crossings that would be passable and the one that might not be. She asked questions and he answered them, and she asked the same questions differently to make sure she had it right. And by the time they were done, she had a map that she trusted as much as she trusted the rope guide to the barn in the first storm. Marlowe. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, not the measured, contained thing, but something raw at the edge of it. "If the weather comes in hard, I've been in hard weather," she said, "not up there." "No." She looked at him directly. "But I'm going anyway, because we've built something here, and I'm not going to let a man with a 30-day ultimatum burn it down." She stood up. "Get some sleep. I'll leave at first light." He looked at her for a long moment in the firelight, and she saw everything he didn't say, the worry in it, and something else, something warmer than worry, that she let herself see without pretending she hadn't. "Take Reeve," he said finally. "He knows bad trails." "I know," she said. "I was going to ask." She went to her small cold room and lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling where the darkness was, and listened to the wind and did not sleep for a long time. She left before the light came, not because she'd planned it that way exactly, but because she'd stopped trying to sleep around 3 in the morning, and lay there listening to the cold settle into the cabin walls until she decided that lying still was doing nothing useful for anyone. She dressed in every layer she had that was practical, not everything she owned, because bulk without function was just weight. And Garrick had told her enough about the lower route that she understood weight was going to matter on the stream crossings. She checked her pack twice. The notebook. Harmon's statement, which she'd collected 2 days ago and which had turned out to be 4 pages in a tight, careful hand from a man who'd clearly decided that if he was going to do it, he was going to do it completely. The threatening note. The deed-documentation that Garrick kept in the locked box under the loft stairs, which he told her the combination to 3 weeks ago for reasons neither of them had named out loud. The map he'd drawn. Enough food for 6 days in case conditions added time. The small folding knife she'd carried since she was 17, and her father had pressed it into her hand and said, "A woman alone needs one practical thing she can always find." She went to check on Garrick before she left. He was asleep. She could hear his breathing from the bottom of the loft ladder, still careful, still costing him something, but steady. She didn't go up. She stood at the bottom of the ladder for a moment in the dark, and then she went outside. Reeve was not pleased to be saddled before dawn in January. He expressed this with his ears and with a significant amount of sidestep and a sound from deep in his chest that communicated a sophisticated equine opinion about the situation. She talked to him the whole time she was tacking him up. Not reassurance exactly, more like information, the way her uncle had taught her that horses responded better to being told what was happening than to being managed around it. "I know," she said, when he tossed his head at the cold bit. "I know, I don't like it either, but we're going, and you know this trail better than I do, so I'm going to need you to think about that." He settled enough, not happy, functional. She led him out of the barn and mounted up and rode for the tree line without looking back at the cabin, because she knew that if she looked back she would think about Garrick alone in there with his wrapped ribs and his wrenched shoulder, and that would make the ride harder than it needed to be. The first hour was familiar ground, the lower section of the mountain she'd been over enough times to read in the dark, following the trail by the density of the pines on either side, and Reeve's confident stride on ground he knew. The temperature was somewhere around what she'd calibrate as serious but not dangerous for a moving body with adequate layers. The sky above the tree line had the specific quality of very cold, clear air. stars with edges, dark that had depth to it. Then the familiar ground ended, and she was on the lower route Garrick had drawn for her, and everything required more attention. The route took them west before it could go south and down toward the valley, swinging around a section of the mountain she hadn't been to. Older growth, denser, the trail reduced to something that was more suggestion than fact in places. She held the map in her memory and counted landmarks the way Garrick had told her to, the boulder with the split face, then downhill bearing left until the second stream, then follow the stream south until you can't anymore, then up and over the saddle. She found the split boulder where he'd said it would be. She followed the slope to the first stream, which was mostly frozen, but with running water visible underneath the ice in the center, and she took Reeve across at the narrow section where the ice was thickest, moving slowly, letting him find his own footing. The second stream was the one he'd flagged as potentially not passable. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of water moving faster than it should be in this temperature, which meant a warm section somewhere upstream had kept it running. She came to the bank and looked at it and understood the concern. Wider than the first, the ice broken in the center, water dark and moving with a kind of confidence that suggested depth. She got off Reeve and walked the bank in both directions for 50 yards each way, looking. Upstream, there was a section where the ice bridged most of the gap, with only a narrow dark channel in the center, and the bank on the far side was low and shelving rather than steep. She stood and looked at it for a while. Reeve stood behind her and breathed visible clouds into the cold air. "All right," she said, more to herself than to him. She went across on foot first, both hands free, testing each step before committing to it, working toward the ice bridge, crossing the open channel where the water came up past her boot tops and filled her left boot with cold. That was so extreme it briefly didn't register as a sensation before it registered as everything. She got across, scrambled up the shelving bank, turned around. Reeve was watching her from the other side with the expression of a horse who has seen humans do stupid things before. "Come on," she said, "straight line to me. Don't stop in the water." He came. He didn't stop. His hooves went through the ice in the shallower section with sounds like breaking plates, and he lurched once on the bank, getting up, but he came and he was fine, and she grabbed his bridle and pressed her forehead against his nose for a moment and said, "Good, that was good." Her left foot was a problem. She got back on and kept moving because moving was the only option. Stopping to address the boot wasn't viable. The temperature wouldn't allow it. She focused on the route and pushed everything else to the part of her mind that would deal with it when it could be dealt with. The first shelter was where Garrick had marked it. A low structure built against a rock face, 3 walls and a partial roof. The kind of basic construction that trappers left for each other on long lines, with the unspoken agreement that anyone who uses it leaves it better than they found it. There was wood inside, stacked by someone else's previous hands. She got a fire going with fingers that were working at about 70% efficiency, and got her boot off and her sock off and looked at her foot. Not frost-bitten. Cold damaged in a way that had moved past numb into the specific bright pain of returning circulation, which was bad to experience and good to experience because the alternative was worse. She held her foot close to the small fire and went through the pack for the dry socks she'd been specific about packing and waited. Outside, the light had fully come up. She'd been riding for nearly 5 hours. She fed Reeve from the pack, checked his legs, melted snow in the small tin she'd brought and let him drink. She ate something herself without tasting it. She looked at the map and looked at where she calculated she was on it and thought about the timeline. She needed to reach the second shelter before dark. The second shelter was, she traced the route in her head, another 4 hours in reasonable conditions. Her left foot was functional again, painful but functional. The weather was holding. She could do this. She did it. The second day was easier in the way that the second day of hard physical work is sometimes easier, not because the conditions improve, but because the body makes a set of decisions about what it's going to accept and stops arguing. Her foot was sore inside the boot, but usable. Reeve had settled into the traveling, reading her seat and her signals with the responsiveness of a horse that was genuinely intelligent and had decided to cooperate with the project. The country she was passing through was the kind that earned its beauty by making you work for it. She had no interest in its beauty specifically, but she noticed it in the peripheral way you notice things when you're operating on alert. The particular blue of ice and shadow, the way the tree line broke open at the high saddle to show a sweep of valley below that went on further than she'd expected. She stopped Reeve at the saddle's crest and looked at it. The valley below, somewhere in it, Stillwater. She was going to make it. She arrived in Stillwater late on the afternoon of the 4th day, which was the best time Garrick had estimated, and then only if conditions held, and conditions had only mostly held, and she had done it anyway through the ice crossing and the foot and a section of the 2nd day where the trail had been obscured by fresh wind drift, and she'd had to go carefully and slowly for 2 hours, trusting the landmarks more than the ground under them. Stillwater was larger than Black Hollow by a factor that made it feel like a different kind of civilization. 2 real streets, a courthouse with its own building, a telegraph office, a hotel that had actual glass in all its windows. She was aware of herself as she rode down the main street, trail-worn and 4 days out of a mountain winter, on a horse that looked as competent as she felt, and probably more presentable, because Reeve at least didn't have dark circles under his eyes. She found the marshal's office, a man named Aldous Cole, who turned out to be in his late 40s, with a face that had made most of its major decisions and wasn't revisiting them. He looked at her when she came in, the particular look of a law officer assessing a new arrival, cataloguing, forming preliminary judgments. She put the notebook on his desk. Then Harmon's statement, then the threatening note, then the de-documentation. She organized them in the sequence that told the clearest story. And then she sat down across from him and said, I have a situation in Black Hollow that involves theft, property destruction, assault resulting in significant injury, and an ongoing land dispute being prosecuted through criminal means. I have documentation for all of it. I'd like to go through it with you. Cole looked at the stack of papers, then at her. You came from Black Hollow? Yes. In this weather, that's 4 days. 4.5, she said. There was an ice crossing. He looked at her for another moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Then he reached for the notebook and opened it, and she started talking. It took 2 hours. Cole was not the kind of man who rushed through documents or accepted summaries in place of details. He read what was in front of him, and when he had questions he asked them precisely. And he wrote things down in his own record with a thoroughness that she found deeply reassuring, because it meant he was treating it as real. When they were done with the documents, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The assault on your husband, you say he couldn't identify the 2 men specifically. He couldn't make a positive identification in the dark and from a hit from behind. But the threatening note arrived the same evening through the same channels Silas Mercer has been using all season, with terms directly related to the land dispute. The connection is clear enough for a working theory, Cole said. Not necessarily enough for a charge on the assault specifically, without either a witness or a confession. He looked at the statement from Harmon. This is useful. A man with direct knowledge of goods, moving through a covered arrangement. He tapped the page. If he'll testify to this in person, he'll testify, she said. He's been looking for the door out of this situation. We've just shown him where it is. Cole looked at her. You're very certain for a woman who just rode 4 days through a mountain winter. I'm certain, she said, because I've been building this for 3 months. Every piece of it, I know what it holds and what it doesn't. The assault charge may need more, but theft, property destruction, and conspiracy to defraud on the land claim is enough to bring Silas Mercer in front of a court and let the community see what he's been doing. Cole nodded slowly. I'll ride to Black Hollow. Give me 2 days to arrange a deputy and get the paperwork right. I'll head back tomorrow, she said. I'd rather be there before you arrive. He looked at her for a moment. Is your husband in a condition to be left alone for another few days? He's in a condition to be left alone, she said, which was the truest answer she could give. She didn't add the rest of it, that leaving him had been the hardest practical decision she'd made in 3 months on that mountain, and she'd made some hard ones. She spent one night in Stillwater in a room at the hotel that had a mattress and a wood stove and no wind finding the gaps in the walls, and she slept for 10 hours without moving and woke up feeling approximately human again. She also, in the evening before she slept, wrote a letter to her mother. She hadn't written since she'd arrived. She'd meant to, had thought about it a dozen times, but there was always a reason not to, which she recognized was mostly that she hadn't known what to say. What she'd found was more complicated than she'd expected, and she hadn't wanted to describe it while she was still in the middle of understanding it. Mama, she wrote, I know I've been slow to write. Things here have been more difficult than I expected, which is not a complaint. I went in expecting difficult and I got difficult, so at least nothing surprised me. The homestead is real, the work is real, the man is real in ways I didn't anticipate. He is not easy to know, neither am I, as it turns out, which means we get along better than either of us predicted. She stopped and looked at the lamp for a moment. I have done things up here I didn't know I could do. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because I think you should know, and because I think maybe I should know it too. I always believed I was capable, and nobody much agreed with me about that. Turns out I was right. I'm well. I'll write more when things are settled. Tell Agnes I'm sorry I haven't written her either, and she should know it's not because I've forgotten her, but because I've been busy surviving, which I think she'll understand. She sealed it and left it at the telegraph office in the morning to be carried with the next post south. Then she got back on Reeve and started the return trip. The return trip was different from the ride out, not easier. Conditions hadn't improved significantly, but she knew the route now in her body, the way you know a route after you've been over it. She knew where the second stream ran too fast, and she knew how to take the ice bridge, and she knew how long the stretch between the two shelters actually took, rather than how long the map suggested it should take. She made it back in 3.5 days, moving faster because she was moving with knowledge instead of against uncertainty. The clearing of the homestead appeared through the trees on a late afternoon in the way it did sometimes, like the mountain showed it to her all at once rather than gradually. The low dark cabin and the smoke from the chimney and the dogs materializing out of the tree line, with Soot at the front, not barking, just running, her whole back end moving with the specific relief of a dog whose person has come back. She got off Reeve in the clearing, and Soot hit her at knee height, and she grabbed the dog's broad head in both hands and said, I know, I'm back, stop. The cabin door opened. Garrick came out onto the step. He was moving better than when she'd left, still careful, still wearing the rib wrap she'd put on him under his shirt, but upright and steady. He'd shaved. She noticed that second. He had his arms at his sides in the posture she'd come to understand, as him not quite knowing what to do with himself in a moment that had feeling in it. She walked towards him. Cole's coming, she said. 2 days behind me, maybe 3. He read everything. He's taking it seriously. Garrick nodded. Something moved through his face. Harmon's statement is the piece that does it, she said. Cole was clear on that. Harmon testifies in person, and Silas has nowhere to stand. Harmon will testify, Garrick said. I think so too. She was close now, close enough to see the specific quality of what was in his face, the complicated thing she'd been watching develop in slow accretion over 3 months of shared cold and shared work and shared stakes. You went through the lower route, he said. Yes. The second stream crossing. Yes. He looked at her for a moment with something that had given up trying to stay neutral. How bad? Left boot, she said. I dealt with it. His jaw tightened. Garrick, I dealt with it and I'm fine, and Cole is 2 days behind me with a deputy. She looked at him straight. Is there coffee? He stepped back from the door. There's coffee. She walked past him into the warmth of the cabin, and heard the door close behind her, and felt the heat from the fire after days of cold in the way that comfort feels after it's been absent long enough to remind you what it's worth. She sat at the table, and he put coffee in front of her without being asked, and sat across from her, and she told him everything. Cole, the conversation, the way the documents had landed, Harmon's statement, and what Cole had said about it, the timeline going forward. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, fully present in the specific way that he was, and when she was done, he looked at the table and said, You could have turned back at the stream. Yes, she said, you didn't. No. He looked up at her and she let him look, and what was between them right then was not something that needed words exactly, though it was also not quite finished being something that would eventually need words, and they were both adult enough and tired enough and honest enough to let it be where it was without forcing it. The east slope is still standing, she said. Yes, he said. Then we're all right. He looked at the fire. Marlowe. She waited. When this is over, he said, when Cole comes and Silas is dealt with and the lines are running the way they should. He stopped. He started again. When things are, Garrick. She said it quietly, not cutting him off so much as giving him permission to not finish sentences that were still finding their shape. I know I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her with the expression he'd worn at Christmas, but more of it, more open, less braced, the expression of a man who'd been holding something shut for a long time and was slowly letting the pressure out. I know you know, he said. I just wanted to say it anyway. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the fire and didn't say anything, and it was the best kind of silence. The kind that wasn't waiting for anything, that wasn't holding any more air than it needed to, that was simply two people in the same room knowing they were in the same room, which is not a smaller thing as it sounds after all. Outside, the mountain cold pressed on, and the pines moved in the wind, and the dogs settled in around the cabin, with the satisfaction of animals whose sense of right order had been restored. 2 days away, a marshal was preparing to ride north with paperwork and a deputy and the weight of the county law behind him. And in the trading post on the south end of Black Hollow, if Jonas Pratt was paying attention, and Pratt was always paying attention, there was starting to be the quality of a situation that was no longer moving in the direction Silas Mercer had arranged. The 30-day ultimatum had 16 days left on it. Silas was about to find out that the woman he dismissed had not spent those days doing what he expected women in her position to do. She had spent them building the case that would end him. Marshal Cole arrived on a Wednesday morning with one deputy and more paperwork than Marlowe had expected, which she took as a good sign. Men who are serious about doing something correctly bring the right documents. She saw them coming up the trail from the tree line and went to the cabin door and said, "They're here." And Garrick came from the workbench where he'd been repairing a trap spring with his good arm and stood behind her and looked. "How many?" he asked. "2, Cole and a deputy." She watched them cross the clearing. "He didn't bring a crowd. That's good. It means he's not coming to make a show. He's coming to do the work." Cole dismounted with the efficiency of a man who'd ridden a lot of miles on a lot of different business and had stopped being impressed by any of it. The deputy was younger, maybe 25, with the look of someone still calibrating what the job required of him. Cole shook Garrick's hand and looked at him with the assessing eye of a man reading how badly hurt someone is without asking directly. "You're moving better than I expected," Cole said. "I've had good care," Garrick said. He didn't look at Marlowe when he said it. He didn't need to. They sat at the table, all 4 of them, which made the cabin feel smaller in a way that was strange after months of it being just 2. And Cole went through what he intended to do with the precision that had impressed Marlowe in Stillwater. He would go into Black Hollow first and speak with Harmon, whose in-person testimony was the center of what he could build a formal charge around. He would then present Silas Mercer with a formal notice regarding the theft investigation, which would include the trapline documentation from Marlowe's notebook, now entered as exhibit material. The property destruction, the smashed trap, and the assault were harder, but Cole had language for them that he walked through carefully. Conspiracy, he said, was a useful word when you had enough connected incidents. "What about Pratt?" Garrick asked. "And Dell. If Mercer lawyers up and tries to put the physical incidents on his men, the men become witnesses against him to reduce their own exposure," Cole said. "That's standard. Pratt especially, and he's been the visible face of this. He'll have to make a choice about whose interest he's protecting when it costs him personally." "Pratt will fold," Marlowe said. Cole looked at her. "You're confident of that?" "He's not loyal. He's employed. There's a difference, and it shows in how he talks." She thought about the thinned-out smile, the recalculation she'd watched happen in real time. He's been doing Silas's work because it was comfortable and paid. The moment it stops being either of those things, he'll have a clearer memory of events. Cole made a note. All right, I'll go into town today. Give me until tomorrow morning before you come in. We're coming in, Garrick said. I want you both there when I speak to Mercer formally. Not as witnesses, the paperwork handles that, but because a man like Mercer has spent years making you look like a losing proposition to this community. When he gets served, I want the community to see who's doing the serving and who's standing on which side of it. He looked between them. That's not legal strategy. That's practical reality about how things work in small settlements. Garrick was quiet for a moment. Marlowe knew what he was thinking. He'd never wanted the public part of any of this. He was a man who preferred to handle his own affairs without an audience. The audience was the thing he'd been avoiding since before she arrived. He's right, she said quietly. Garrick looked at her. The community saw 10 women leave. They've been told a story about this homestead for years. Silas has been telling it. She held his gaze. We need to be there when that story ends. He looked at the table, then he nodded. Cole and his deputy rode back down the mountain, and Marlowe and Garrick spent the rest of that day doing the ordinary work of the homestead, the horses, the stores, the trapline check, in a silence that had a particular quality to it, the quality of the hours before something breaks open, when everything feels suspended and slightly unreal. That night she couldn't eat much. Garrick noticed and didn't comment, which was the right response. She noticed that he didn't eat much either. Are you scared? She asked. It was late, the fire low. The kind of hour when the honest question is easier than it would be in full daylight. He thought about it. Not scared, something like it. He looked at the embers. I've been fighting this alone for 6 years, being patient, keeping my head down and doing my work and waiting for Silas to make a mistake I could use. He stopped. And then you came, and in 3 months it's actually happening. Does that bother you? She asked carefully. That it took someone else? He looked at her with a directness that she'd come to understand was his version of full honesty. It bothers me that it took me so long to understand I couldn't do it alone. That's different from it bothering me that you're here. He paused. You being here is the best thing that's happened on this mountain in a long time, Marlowe. That's not bothering me. She looked at the fire and let those words settle where they landed and didn't deflect them the way she might have 6 months ago, back in Cutter's Creek, where she'd learned to manage her expectations down to a size that couldn't disappoint her. Get some sleep, she said, because she was not ready to say the rest of it yet, and she had a feeling they both knew that and neither of them was in a hurry, which was its own kind of answer. They rode into Black Hollow the next morning under a sky that had gone the specific pale grey of late January. The cold still serious but not aggressive, the kind of winter day that felt like it might be willing to negotiate. Garrick rode, Reeve and Marlowe rode Hester, whose leg had been sound for weeks and who moved with the fluid confidence of a horse that had been properly cared for and knew it. The town was already arranged as if it had been waiting. She would think about that later, how word travels in small places, how people develop an instinct for when something is about to happen that changes the shape of things. Cole had been there since yesterday afternoon, and Harmon had clearly talked because there were people on the street who had no practical reason to be on the street on a cold Wednesday morning in January. The woman with the apron from the saloon steps, the cluster by the dry goods, old Harmon himself, standing in the doorway of the trading post with his hands in his pockets, watching them ride in with an expression that Marlowe read as a man who had made his decision and was now experiencing what decisions feel like once they're made and can't be unmade. Cole was waiting in front of the trading post with his deputy. He gave Garrick a nod and gave Marlowe a look that she understood as acknowledgement, not admiration, just the straightforward recognition of one capable person for another. Mercer's been sent word, Cole said. He'll be here inside the hour. Pratt already came to me this morning. A pause. You were right about Pratt. He talked for 40 minutes. She had no satisfaction in it, exactly. She'd expected it. What did he say? Enough. Cole left it there, which she understood meant it was enough that she didn't need to know the details right now. Silas Mercer arrived in 35 minutes, not an hour. That told her something. A man who moves faster than he said he would is either very confident or very afraid, and the two can look identical from the outside until you're close enough to see the difference. She'd never seen Silas Mercer before. She'd built a picture of him from what Garrick had told her and from what his actions had communicated, and the picture had given her a man of calculation, patience, and the specific arrogance of someone who has operated without real consequences for long enough to believe himself immune to them. The man who rode up was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, well-dressed for the environment in the way that spoke of money rather than practicality. He had a broad face that had probably been handsome at 20 and had since settled into something that worked hard to project authority. He came with two men behind him, neither of them Pratt, she noticed. He looked at Cole first, then at Garrick, then at Marlowe, and she watched his assessment of her happen in real time. The same assessment she'd been subjected to her entire life. The quick read, the categorization, the silent conclusion. She held his gaze and did not move. Garrick, Silas said. He had a voice that was used to rooms. I heard there was some sort of misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Cole said, before Garrick could answer. He produced documents from his coat. Mr. Mercer, I have here a formal notice of investigation regarding theft of trapline catches and cured goods from the Vane homestead property, property destruction, assault, and conspiracy to defraud in relation to land claim documentation. He held them out. This isn't a conversation, this is a notice. Silas didn't take the documents immediately. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he's been expecting and has been telling himself won't actually arrive. That's a substantial list of accusations for a man with no evidence. There is evidence, Cole said. Substantial documentation of trapline interference over a 3-month period. A sworn statement from Edgar Harmon regarding goods moved through his property under arrangements he's prepared to testify to. Physical documentation of property destruction. And testimony from Jonas Pratt regarding specific instructions received from you. He let that last one land. Mr. Pratt was quite forthcoming. Something moved through Silas Mercer's face, not panic. He was too controlled for panic, but the specific expression of a man watching a structure he's built carefully develop a crack in its load-bearing wall. Pratt doesn't know anything, Silas said. The voice had dropped its room-filling quality somewhat. He knows quite a lot, as it turns out. Cole handed the documents to the deputy, who held them out until Silas took them. You'll want to read those and get yourself a lawyer, Mr. Mercer. The county court has a docket in March. I expect we'll see you on it. The street was very quiet. Marlowe was aware of every person watching. The woman from the saloon steps, the cluster at the dry goods, Harmon in his doorway, 6 others who'd found the vicinity interesting this morning. She was aware of Garrick beside her on Reeve, still and contained, and she was aware of her own stillness, which was not the stillness of tension, but of someone who has done the work and can afford to be still now. Silas looked up from the documents and looked at Garrick with an expression that was trying to locate anger and finding something more complicated underneath it. 6 years, he said. You had nothing for 6 years. I had the deed, Garrick said. I always had the deed, and I had the patience to wait for you to leave enough of a trail. He paused. You made it easier than I expected, honestly. You got comfortable. Silas looked at Marlowe then. Full, direct. The first time he'd looked at her that way since he'd arrived. She looked back. She didn't do anything with her face that she didn't mean. You, he said. It wasn't an accusation exactly. It was more the sound of a man doing a very late accounting. Me, she said. He looked at her for another moment. At this woman he'd never factored into his calculations, who hadn't been in his picture of how this winter would go, who had come up a mountain in January with a notebook and 4 days of cold trail behind her, and had walked into a marshal's office and put 6 years of his careful work on a desk and said, here, this is what he's been doing. And she could see him understand fully and finally exactly what he'd underestimated and why. I didn't say anything else. He put the documents in his coat and turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and his 2 men followed him, and the street of Black Hollow watched him go. After a moment, someone in the crowd, she never knew who, said something low that wasn't quite audible, and then Harmon came out of his doorway and walked across to where Garrick sat on Reeve and held up his hand, and Garrick looked at it for a moment and shook it, and that was the sound of something shifting. The small sounds of a community beginning to reread a story it had been telling itself wrong. It was not a parade. It was not a vindication in the dramatic sense that stories sometimes manufacture. It was a cold January morning in a small town, and a man with documents riding away, and the people who had watched a version of events for years beginning to reckon with the fact that they'd watched it wrong. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough. Cole came and found Marlowe while Garrick was talking to Harmon. "The March court date is likely," he said. "I'll need you both for testimony. The land claim documentation and the notebook are the most critical. Your account of the Pratt visits corroborates the conspiracy element." He looked at her with the direct look she'd gotten used to from him. "You did good work here, the documentation especially. Without the notebook, there are gaps that are hard to bridge." "I just wrote down what I saw," she said. "Most people don't bother," he said. "That's usually why the gaps exist." She thought about that later. On the ride back up the mountain, with the pale grey sky pressing down on the Black Hollow range and the cold doing its January work, and the homestead waiting somewhere up in the trees ahead of them, she thought about what it meant to pay attention to things carefully enough and consistently enough to make them count. She'd done it in a small notebook with a stubby pencil. She'd done it the way she'd done most things in her life, without anyone watching, without any particular encouragement, because it was the correct thing to do, and she was capable of doing it, and those 2 facts were sufficient reason. The homestead clearing appeared through the trees, and the dogs came out, and Soot ran to her stirrup, and Marlowe got down and put her hand on the dog's head and looked at the cabin, the low dark shape of it, the smoke from the chimney, the partially repaired smokehouse leaning less than it used to now that she'd gotten into the east wall over the winter, and felt something that was not simple and not clean but was real. She'd come up this mountain expecting to be turned away. She'd stayed because she was capable of staying. And somewhere between the root cellar and the ice crossing and the notebook full of dates and boot prints, and the 4-day ride through January with a wet boot, she had stopped being someone things happened to and had become, without announcing it, the person who decided what happened next. That was not a transformation. It had not happened in a single moment. It was a long accretion of small decisions, each one made in the cold with numb hands and imperfect information, each one building on the one before. She was not a different person than she'd been in Cutter's Creek. She was the same person, finally in a place that asked the right questions of her. Garrick unsaddled the horses beside her, working around his shoulder with the accommodation he'd developed for it. He'd carry some stiffness from that injury into the spring and probably past it, she thought. He moved with the particular stubbornness of a man who is in more pain than he's telling anyone and has decided that functional is the same as fine. "Garrick," she said, "your shoulder is not fine." He was quiet for a moment. "It's functional." "That's not what I said." He looked at her over Reeve's back. "It'll sort itself out by spring. It'll sort itself out faster if you let me look at it properly instead of pretending it doesn't exist." She held his gaze. "That's not a request." A pause, then something that was as close to a rueful expression as Garrick Vane's face had produced in her presence. "After supper," he said. "Before," she said. He came inside and let her look at it. The damage was what she'd thought. The muscle had been wrenched badly and had been compensating for weeks in ways that were building a secondary problem in the surrounding tissue. She showed him the exercises her father had used after a similar injury, pressing his hand against the resistance of hers, moving the joint through ranges that made him breathe carefully through his nose. "Twice a day," she said, "for at least a month. That seems like a lot." "It is a lot. Do it anyway." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to understand as the one he used when he was deciding whether to argue and had concluded it wasn't worth it. all right. She made supper and they ate it, and the fire did its work on the cabin, and the dogs arranged themselves in their usual positions, and outside the mountain, winter continued, indifferent and enormous, and requiring nothing of them at this particular moment, except that they stay warm and feed themselves and rest. It was, she thought, a remarkable thing to be in a place that required nothing of you for one evening. She had spent most of her life somewhere that required constant management, managing how she took up space, managing what she said and didn't say, managing the gap between who she was and what the available situations were asking her to be. Up here, the management that was required of her was of a different kind, cold and practical and honest. It suited her in a way that nothing before had quite suited her. She did the dishes in the basin by the stove, and Garrick sat at the table and looked at the fire and said, without preamble, "Those 10 women." She waited. "People in town think I rejected them," he said, "or that they rejected me. Neither version is exactly right." He looked at his hands. 2 of them didn't get off the wagon, that part was true. But the others, most of them were sent here for the land, by families who wanted the connection to the acreage, the claim. They were clear about it with me, not unkind, just clear. They'd been told to secure an arrangement, and they were trying to do it. And they didn't want to be on a mountain in Montana. And I didn't want someone who didn't want to be here. He paused. One of them was kind. She tried to make it work for 3 months. But she was lonely in a way I couldn't fix, and she knew it, and eventually she left. And I don't blame her. Marlowe dried her hands and sat down. She wasn't going to interrupt this. I kept the arrangement running because I needed help on the homestead, and I kept thinking, he stopped, I kept thinking there'd be a woman who came for the right reason, who wanted the actual situation. The mountain and the cold and the work and the isolation. He looked at her. You came for the right reason. I came because your letter talked about capability, she said. I know, that's why I wrote it that way. He held her gaze. The other letters I'd sent were warmer, more appealing, and they attracted women who wanted an appealing situation, not the real one. So I tried writing the real one. He paused. You were the only one who answered it. She thought about that, about a man revising his letter after 10 failed attempts, stripping out the warmth and the appeal, and leaving only the plain truth of what the situation was, and waiting to see if anyone wanted plain truth. She thought about herself in Cutter's Creek, reading that letter and thinking, yes, that's a language I speak. We were both trying to find the same thing, she said, someone who didn't need it to be prettier than it was. Yes, he said. They sat with that for a moment. Marlowe. His voice had the quality it had on Christmas, slightly braced, moving towards something carefully. I want to say something, and I don't want you to manage your response. I want you to just hear it. She folded her hands on the table. All right. I'm glad you stayed, he said, not because of the trap lines or the root cellar or coal and the documents. Before any of that, I was glad from the first week. I didn't know how to say it because I'd gotten used to saying nothing. He looked at the fire and back at her. I'm still not good at it, but I'm trying to be less bad at it. She looked at this man, his rough jaw and his careful eyes and his shoulder that hurt more than he'd admit, and his hands that could draw the east slope from memory with enough detail to mean something, and thought about what it costs a person to say a true thing plainly after years of not saying things. She thought about what it had cost her too, all the years of shrinking the available truth down to a manageable size. I know, she said, I'm glad too. And then because she thought he deserved more than that, I didn't come here knowing it would be this. I came here thinking I'd find work and a roof and maybe some distance from a place that didn't know what to do with me. What I found was considerably more than that. She looked at him steadily. You're a difficult man to know. You're worth the difficulty. I was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, that's the best thing anyone has said to me in a long time. I imagine the bar was low, she said, and the thing that crossed his face then was a real smile, imperfect, brief, unfamiliar on his features but completely genuine, and she thought she would remember that smile longer than most things. The March court date came and went with the slow machinery of county law grinding through what Marlowe and Cole had built. Silas Mercer hired a lawyer from the capital who was very good and who managed to reduce 3 of the charges substantially through procedural work that was impressive and infuriating in equal measure. But Harmon testified in person and held his nerve, and the sworn statement stood, and the trapline documentation and the threatening note were entered without dispute. And at the end of it, Silas Mercer was fined, ordered to make restitution at a figure that was close to what he'd stolen over 2 seasons. And the East Slope land claim dispute was formally resolved in Garrick's favor, with the original deed entered into county record in a way that could not be informally revised by anyone's conversation with anyone's clerk. Hunt didn't go to jail. That bothered Marlowe more than she showed. The lawyer had done his work, and the gaps in the assault evidence that Cole had flagged were real gaps, and the legal system was what it was. But he lost the South Ridge claim he'd been pressing for 6 years. He lost his reputation in Black Hollow at a speed that surprised even her, and he left the territory by April, sold the South Ridge claim, and left without ceremony. And Black Hollow watched him go with the collective expression of a community that had backed the wrong man and knew it, and was now in the business of quietly renegotiating its sense of events. Pratt got a reduced charge, testified, and moved on to somewhere further west where his particular skill set might still be useful. Dell vanished before the court date and was not pursued with any urgency. Harmon paid back his debt formally to Cole as part of the restitution process, and reopened the Trading Post back storeroom to legitimate use, and he was decent to Marlowe when she came in for supplies in a way that was different from before, the decency of a man who owes something and is trying to pay it in the only currency currently available. Spring came to the Black Hollow Range the way it always came, reluctantly, with setbacks, with weeks where winter reasserted itself, just when you'd started to trust the warmth. The frozen spring on the East Slope ran again in March, first a trickle and then a real flow, and Marlowe went up there alone one afternoon to watch it, and stood in the specific quiet of a mountain moving from one season into another, and thought about water moving under ice for months and months and then finding the surface again. The homestead shed its winter evidence slowly, the packed drifts receding from the walls, the ground reappearing in the clearing, the smokehouse east wall getting the proper repair it had needed since before she arrived, this time done right with Garrick on one side and Marlowe on the other, and Soot supervising from a position of full indifference. She wrote to her mother again in April and said, "I think I'm staying, Mama. I think this is the place. I can't explain it better than that, except to say that here I am useful in ways that are real and needed and not managed, down to a size that's easier for everyone else. I have a husband who doesn't need me to be easier. That turns out to be worth a great deal." Her mother wrote back and said, "Then stay, Marlowe. You were always too much for that town anyway." She was sitting at the table reading that letter when Garrick came in from the barn, and she handed it to him without explanation, and he read it and set it down and said, "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman." "She is," Marlowe said. He sat across from her and looked at the table for a moment, and then looked up. Outside the cabin window, the light was doing the thing it did in late April in the mountains, that long particular gold that only exists for a few weeks before summer comes and changes it. The clearing had mud in it from the thaw, deep and honest mud that pulled at your boots and required real effort to move through. The dogs were outside in it, unbothered. The horses were out in the small paddock because the snow was gone enough to make it possible. There was so much work ahead of them. The trap lines needed reorganizing now that they could run them properly without Silas Mercer's interference, and the East Slope wanted fencing across the lower section, and the smokehouse repair needed finishing, and the root cellar would want checking after the spring drainage to see if her work from the fall had held. It had held. She already knew it had held, but she'd check it anyway, because checking things you've built is how you learn to build them better. "We should talk about what we want the East Slope to do," she said, "in terms of summer use. If we're running the horses up there, we should," he said. "Summer grazing up there would take pressure off the lower paddock. I want to trace the full drainage before we decide on the fence line. I want to understand where the water actually goes." "I know where it goes," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I want to know too." He looked at her with the look, the one she'd been watching soften incrementally over 6 months from measuring into something that had no measurement in it at all. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll take you through the whole drainage line." "Good," she said. Outside, the gold light moved across the clearing, and the mountain was loud with the sounds of things coming back to life after winter. Birds she hadn't heard since October, water running in the small channels off the slope, the specific sound of mud and thaw, and the world reconstituting itself after all that cold. It was not a quiet spring, the Black Hollow Range. It came back insistently, with volume, not asking permission from the winter it was replacing. Marlowe Reed, Marlowe Vane now, in the county record, in the formal arrangement that neither of them talked about much, because they were both people who found that what was done spoke more clearly than what was said about the doing, sat at the table in the cabin on the mountain that had not killed her, and thought about how strange it was that the right place was so often the hardest one to get to. Not strange, maybe. Probably not strange at all. Probably just the way it worked that the things worth having were behind the things most people turned around at. The ice crossing, the bad weather, the town that laughed, the man who didn't know how to say what he meant and had to try to show it instead. She had not been the woman anyone would have picked for this mountain. She was exactly the woman this mountain needed. She folded her mother's letter and put it in her coat pocket beside the folded drawing of the east slope, which had been there since Christmas and was soft along the creases now from being carried so long. She would keep both of them there for a while yet. Some things you carry until you don't need to carry them anymore, until you've absorbed what they were trying to tell you, and the paper is just paper. She wasn't there yet. But she was somewhere. She was, for the first time in her life, exactly and completely somewhere. And it was enough, and it was real. And the spring light came through the window, and the dogs were alive with noise out in the clearing. And Garrick Vane was sitting across from her talking about fencing and drainage as if she had always been here, as if the mountain had been waiting all along for someone who wouldn't walk away from it. Maybe it had been.